So we are living in an English-speaking world. So look at the map. So most of the people in the global society today, they are speaking English. Some people are speaking English as a mother tongue, and other people are speaking English as a second language, and another people will be speaking English as a foreign tongue. Yes, indeed, English today, English is dominant. So English is dominant language when you are doing any areas of modern affairs. Air traffic control, so English is the language of education, academic community, and English is a dominant language for media, press, cinema, and advertising. So English is the major communication, major medium of communication for the political forum, and you should be able to speak English at the academic meeting. And also, English is the major instrument for the computer and communication. So let's take an example. This is the global internet. Global internet is purely an English affair. The more than 90% of computer data is written in English. As you know, the computer genius, the Bill Gates, was born in the United States. So let's imagine if Bill Gates was born in China, the word could have been changed. The word could have been different. Then how about air traffic control? There is only one language for airplanes taking off and land on for more than 200 countries. English is the only language. English is the only language for the cockpit in the airplane. The pilot should be able to speak English, and captain should be able to speak English. And how about financial center? There is a global financial center, as you know, it's located in New York or London. This is a financial center, and English is a means to access these global financial centers in New York and London. So why should be English? So far that we have considered English position from three perspectives. First, so why English deserves to be a global level as a global language? First, is it about its power of speakers? And second, we have discussed is about its number of the speakers. And third topic we have mentioned is about its cultural legacy, like English literature. So let's get back to our first module, is the power of speakers. In this regard, we can look at this issue from three different times. The first driver took place in the 18th and 19th century. So this is a time the British emerged. British have become the global British Empire. So this is a time the English began to spread around the world. In another word, geographic spread of English was driven by the rise of British Empire. In another word, wherever the Union Jack, the national flag of Britain, goes in the world, anywhere in the world, the English language followed. And if it doesn't stop there, there is another second momentum. What is it? The second momentum for the English to become the global language comes in the 19th and 20th century. So I would say that is the industrial evolution in Britain. In other words, Britain has become the engine of the global manufacturing base. There were a lot of factories of textile and mining business and manufacturing factories in London. So that is industrial evolution that has become the second momentum for English to become the global language. And finally, that was another growth momentum that happens in 20th century. So as I have talked to that, it was the rise of America as the economic leader. So English has become a means to access American leadership in economy and business. So these are the three three steps that we have taken a look to explain why the rise of English as a global language has something to do with its power of the speakers. So look at the map. As you can see, the British Empire, its peak came in 18th and 19th century. And this is a time that English began to spread around the world. It happened during the 2 centuries from 18th century to 20th century. And also, I have talked about Industrial Revolution. That is another driver of English language to become the global language. Why? Because that has something to do with the rise of middle class in London. So this concept of middle class is very important when we try to explain why English is very useful as a global language that we are going to explain later. So, we also have talked about power is not the only factor in determining the global status of English. So in this case, to back up our argument, we talked about Norman conquest, but there was no linguistic conquest. So even though the Frenchman conquered the Britain by military power, but the Frenchman could not conquer English language as a mainstream language for the British people. English survived the Roman conquest. This was the case we already mentioned in our former class. So let's move on to the second module. We talked about then what is the source of English power. So is it about the number of speakers? So in this case, we mentioned this list. Look at the map. If you use the criteria, the number of the speakers in determining which language deserves the global level, then this table shows something else. According to the number of the languages, the China tops the list. China comes out on the top. So we can come to realize that there is something else in determining a language as a global language here. So let's move on to the third module. So we were talking about English literature. Why? Because English literature in different time can be used as a window to see the British society during the different time. So in this regard, we chose 3 representative literature that represent each different time. First, we talked about Beowulf, that is the oldest narrative epic that represents the Anglo-Saxon society in 500 AD. And the second one was the Canterbury Tales that represents the rise of the East Midland as the dominant style of standard English. And we also talked about Shakespeare, who represents the rise of English literature. So if we see these 3 representative literatures, we can see how English was evolving from time to time. For example, the Beowulf challenges traditional concept of Anglo-Saxon society as very savage and crude, because the Beowulf, we can find the spirit of the value of the courage and the warrior. And also in the Canterbury Tales, that we can see a lot of stories that reflect how the society at the time. And also the next module was the Bible Trail. So in this Bible Trail, we have talked about 3 major topics. The first topic was the royal power was used for Bible translation. The first royal power was the Greek pharaoh of Egypt, Philadelphus II. I don't know why, but he was inspired to translate the Bible from Hebrew to the Greek language. And the second royal power was James I. then he was also persuaded by a minority of Puritan believers to make a new translation of English. And the second topic on this Bible trail that we dealt with was the Christian conversion of early British society. So we talked about the second coming of Saint Augustus, Saint Augustus arrived in British Island, and he worked very hard to achieve his missionary goal of Christian conversion. So his first target was English king and queen, because he believed if he persuaded the king and queen, other people will follow them. But it didn't work always. Why? Because the British people has a double standard. What was the double standard? The British people at that time, their value system is based on paganism. The paganism is the belief of Anglo-Saxon people. And also the third topic is the religious division between Puritan and the Old Catholic. And we also talked about what is the impact of religious division on the British society. And we also talked about that's the chance for British society to extend into the new territory, America. Because the Puritan people were persecuted and they were object of mockery by mainstream British people. So the Puritan people, they decided to take their chance, and they decided to leave their homeland, and they had for the America, with the American dream, to start a new life. And also on the Bible trail, this is a very important one. Bible happens to be at the right time, at the right place. So Jesus was born when the Greek language was available for missionary tour. Was it a coincidence? And also, Jesus was born when the Roman Empire, they began to lay colonial path for Christian conversion. What does it mean? So Jesus was born when the Roman Empire began to rise, and when they begin to conquer, and they begin to have one colony after another. And the first thing the Roman Empire did after they get the colony was to build the road, the Roman roads, because they built the roads for the tax collection reason, for collecting the taxes from the colony. But the Roman roads were used by the early Christian missionaries like Apostle Paul. And also we're talking about the use of Latin language by the Roman Catholic. The Latin language remained a very regional lingua franca for the churches and for the religion, because the Roman Catholic remained very powerful until the Renaissance. Then it's a mystery. It's also the English happens to be available as a common language for the common language for the mission of the whole world. So this summed up as the Bible. Bible happens to be at the right time, at the right place. So, as putting all together, then we have another question, another point very important is that today the word English, the English as a global language is mostly the contemporary phenomenon. Actually, it is the phenomenon that took place in the past century. It's the phenomenon of the 20th or 21st centuries. So, in other words, the rise of English, they started only the recent decades. So, if we can realize it if you look at some British quotes from different times. First, Let me quote from John Wallis in England in 1765. He said, "All kinds of literature are widely available in English editions, and there is scarcely any worthwhile body of knowledge which has not been recorded today in the English language." Please remember, this is the 18th century, but John Wallis already was very confident about the value of English language as a global language. He said, "What's the worth of any knowledge if it is not recorded in English?" That was his point. Let me quote another from Richard Mulcaster. He said in 1582, "I love Rome, but London better. I favor Italy, but England more. I honor the Latin, but I worship the English." So it sounds there is nothing surprising in this quote, but at that time, please, if we consider that he lived in the time that when many believed English shouldn't be a match with the Latin language. At that time, Latin used to be a dominant language for the religion and the churches. So many people believed that English should not replace the place of Latin. But even though decades later, Shakespeare gave him some evidence. So let's look at another quote in 1582. So he said, "English was no real match for Latin at an international level. Our English tongue is of small reach. English, in another word, English stayed within the island. At that time, few people traveled abroad. Then, 2 years later, the Walter Raleigh made the first expedition to America." So you can see only in 16th century, English used to remain as a local language only for the insiders of the island. And few people had expected that English would become a global language. So let me quote another quote from Richard Flecknoe. He said in 1650, he reflected on his 10-year journey through Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. Then he found that Spanish and Dutch were the really useful languages to know, with English being only occasionally helpful. So it's amazing, only in 17th century, then he was traveling around the world, but English was not a match if he compared it with the Dutch or Spanish. In other words, Spanish and Dutch were more frequently used in the global society than English. So, David Hume said in 1767, "In 1767, French was the language of international diplomacy." So he saw in America the future success of English. And he said, "Let the French triumph in the present diffusion of their tongue. Our solid and increasing establishment in America promised a superior stability to the English." So what is the message here? At that time, French was spoken more frequently as the language of diplomacy. So he said, okay, let French language prevail. Okay, let the French language be the dominant in present day. But he had a confidence someday English will eventually become a global language. Global language, why? Because of American rise as a power. So how about John Adams? He said in 1780, he said in the Congress, "English is destined to be in the next and succeeding centuries more generally the language of the world than Latin was in the past or French is in the present age, because the increasing population in America and their universal connection. So, what's the message from John Adams? It's only 1780. Then he said in the Congress, English will become, he predicted English to become the dominant language of the world. So he already had the confidence because English will become dominant language for the global society as Latin was in the past, as the French is at then present time. So let's put it all together. So we have come to realize, so when a language arrives at a new land, the language is not adopted. There is one condition. What is the condition? A language should prove its value for the society and the speakers. So if a language is to be adopted by a country or by people, it should prove its worth. So what is its usefulness? So in which situation a language could be useful for the people who speak it? These are the major questions we must answer. In another word, a language proves to be socially useful if it is to be the world language. If you want to answer to this question, we want to talk about the social history of English movement. So not only within Britain, but also English movement around the world. In other words, we should be able to talk about social history of the global society in relation to English so that we can see a connection between a language and the global society. Then we should be able to answer to this question, how a language proves to be socially useful. So the first question is, why was English useful in Britain, insiders, for the people who speak English as a mother tongue? So in this case, that we have three stories to explain the English usefulness in British people. The first is English survival under the Norman conquest. As you know, the French Norman, they conquered the British with military power. At first, that the French language was the language of the upper people, nobility, and the English was a language for the low-life people. However, it took 200 years for English to survive the Norman conquest. English eventually became the dominant language for the British people. So why? There must be some reason why English could survive the Norman conquest. So this is that we should find, you should be able to answer to this question. And also the second story is Queen Elizabeth I. As you know, she is the British queen who laid the foundation for the Britain to become the British Empire. And she made a very famous speech at the port of Tilbury. And this showed something about why English language was useful for British people. And also we have another story in the 19th century British Empire, that what is the value of English? At that time, the English was a unifying force that combines all the British Empire and its colonies. So, when we try to answer to this question, why English was useful, there was a man, British hero, they must remember. His name is King Alfred the Great. He lived in 845 to 899. So at that time, he is the most important for the survival and spread of English. Why? Because he had a courage and he is a great warrior, so he could defeat the Viking invasion. So if we had failed, if we couldn't drive back the invading Viking forces, then it's questionable whether English could become the mother tongue language for the British people. Maybe the word language could have been something else. Maybe the word language could be the language of the Viking. For example, the Sweden and Denmark and Norway, that could be the mother tongue language for the British people. If we have no hero like King Alfred the Great. So anyway, the king was courageous enough. He was a great warrior and defeated Viking forces, and then made a peace agreement with the Vikings. So this is the way that English could survive the Viking invasion. So another word, in this case, we can see the English was useful because it was a unifying medium of national identity. In another word, English was a unifying force that supports the British sense of national identity, national pride. So King Alfred the Great was the British hero who made the British identity and British pride possible. So there is another heroine that we must remember when we are trying to answer to the question of why English was useful. The Queen, it was 1588, the Britain faced invasion threat from an ally of Spain. As you know, at that time, Spanish military power was at its peak. Spanish power was bigger than the British power. So let's imagine the picture. There were thousands of Spanish enemy soldiers. They were camping on the other side of English Channel. And the Queen Elizabeth, he rode on the horseback and he went to the port of Tilbury. Of course, his subject tried to, you shouldn't go there, but he refused to listen to them, and she bravely raced to the port of Tilbury on the Thames, and to rally his troops. And she was wearing a silver breastplate, and she delivered the most famous speech of her reign. This is her speech, is here. So in this speech, that we can note that she raised her Englishness by using Anglo-Saxon expressions. So, for example, she said in her speech of Tilbury, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. And think if I'll scorn that the Frama or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare invade the borders of my realm, to which rather than any dishonor shall go by me, and myself will take up arms." We can see the Queen's leadership, and there is a courage and determination and her commitment. And these are all the culture based on Anglo-Saxon culture that is very Englishness. She used English language, majorly in Anglo-Saxon expression, to emphasize the Englishness, in another word, the national identity as British people. She emphasized British, she appealed to British identity, British sense of pride and national identity by using the Anglo-Saxon language. So this shows the power of English that supported her leadership. Then we have another question. So I was talking about why the English was useful for British insiders. The English language was a unifying force for the British mother tongue speakers. But how about the outerling countries. Why English was useful for the outer circle countries here. So when we try to answer to this question, here comes today's topic of a global turning point. So in the linguistic history, there were several global turning points that caused a language to rise or fall as dominant language. So in other words, there is an event changing. There is some game-changing event that was so drastic that it changes the position of a language. So in this discussion, let's focus on English language in the 19th and 20th century that caused English worth of a global status. What does it mean? It is not until the 19th and 20th century that English began to rise as a common world language. In other words, it's a contemporary phenomenon for English language to be emerging as a world's common language. So we are interested, what are the events? What are the global trends that made it possible? So we are going to identify what are the global turning points that is behind English rise as a global language. So according to our text input, our textbook author, David Crystal, identified the three things as a global turning point that made it possible English to become the world common language. The first one is political development, and second one is access to knowledge, and third one is Britain and USA emerging as a global financial center. These are the three topics that is mentioned as a global turning point. So that made it possible for English, they laid a foundation for English to rise as a world's common language. So this is the global turning point of spread of English here. So when we are trying to explain the spread of English, we often use this concept. The USA linguist Brashi Kashiru, he made this concept of three circles of English. And these three circles of English is very useful for us to understand the spread of English around the world. As you know, there are three circles in the spread of English. The first one is inner circle. So the second one is outer circle. And third one, outer circle or extended circle, and the other one is the expanding circle. So let me explain one by one. The first one is inner circle. What is inner circle? Inner circle is those people who are speaking English as a mother tongue. It could be standard English or local varieties of English. So anyway, these are the traditional base of English where it is the primary language. As you can see at the global map, and inner circle countries are the Britain, the USA, the New Zealand, Australia, Ireland. These are the inner circle countries. Then the second one is outer circle. This is extended circle. You can see that all these countries, the outer circle refers to the people who speak English as a second language. And this country has something in common. They usually have the colonial historic background. For example, like African country or India and Singapore, they used to be colonies of English-speaking countries like Britain or the USA. So they have a colonial history background. So also this is the earlier stage of spread of English in a multilingual setting. So please note here, the outer circle countries, they usually have a multilingual setting. What does it mean? In these countries, they have several varieties of languages. So these countries are different from Korean case. In Korean case, we are usually our Korean society is not multilingual setting. Our Korean society is monolingual setting. So the outer circle countries, example of outer circle countries are Singapore, India, Malawi, and other 50 other territories. So the outer circle countries that they also refer to as extended circle. Yeah? And we can also, they are the people who are speaking English as a second language. So in short, they are referred to as ESL. Yeah? So English is used as official language in many public domains like media, administration, and legislation, and education. So finally, let's move on to extending circle. So it is notable to see the extending circle began to form only from 1980s. So it's a very recent phenomenon. So extending circle is growing more rapidly than any other circle. So these nations use English as a foreign language without colonial history, like China, Japan, maybe Korea, and Poland. So why? Because these countries, they recognize the value of English as a global language. So we have a question, what is the value of the English language? And what is the changing status of these countries like China and Japan and Poland? So what is their need for speaking English? These are the questions we will be discussing later. So it is often said that there were L1 inner circle speaker, there is L2 speakers. So the linguistic was often talking about L1. L1 stands for people who have a variety of English as a primary language or mother tongue language. That are L1 speakers. And linguists also talking about L2. So L2 stands for people who have learned a variety of English as a second language. Anyway, let's get back to our topic. So what is the global turning point in the 19th and 20th century? So let me take an example. Let me take a case. So let's talk about new independent states in Africa. As you know, there are many new independent states in Africa after 2 times of World War. So African territory were divided into colonies of France, French, and Portugal, and Spanish, and British empires. Then suddenly they become independent. So as they become independent, these African countries, they had to make a choice. What should be their mother tongue? So they were in dilemma. Why? Because in these African countries, they were multilingual countries. There were so many different dialects. There are so many varieties of their languages. So they couldn't understand each other within the country. So there are so many competition among the local varieties of language. So they need a language, a unifying language that can combine the whole country into one identity. So what is their choice? That was English. In another word, English served as a unifying medium of communication for the entire community in the African country. So that's where the value of the English for the African countries. Without English, they couldn't find any language that can combine all the different tribes of people into one identity, into one national identity. Because their language was so different and language was so diverse, they needed some unifying language that can combine all the different tribes into one national identity. So here, English served as a unifying medium of communication for these African countries. And on the other hand, English also served as a bond between the colony and Britain. In other words, even though they become independent, they still maintained their connection with Britain or France or Portuguese or Spain. They maintain their connection with these former empires. Why? Because maybe they have a lot of reasons, because they need to access because of the career goal. If they want to get a better job, they should be able to speak standard English. If they are taking their career as a lawyer or a professor or a successful businessman, English was useful for them. Standard English was useful for them to achieve their career goal. So there is another global turning point at that time, in 19th and 20th century, that was for the spread of English, that was access to knowledge. So what does it mean here? So British in 19th century, it has become the workshop of the world. What does it mean? The British was at the central gravity of the global society for the production of for the production. It was manufacturing base. And also the British was at the central gravity of the global society for the rise of middle class. And also British was at the forefront of developing new technologies and science advances. And the British society was rapidly evolving because of its development of transportation means. So this means the British emerged as at the center of global society. So if you want to access the British leadership, industrial revolution, and manufacturing base and technologies, then you should be able to use English language. Why? Because English is a means to access the British power. That is based on a wide spectrum of industries like transportation, technology, and media, and every area of industries that is related to people's daily life. So the third global point that our textbook author mentioned was taken of course and called identity issue. What is taken of course? So he was talking about English was taken as a matter of course as a mother tongue language by Americans. As you know, Americans, they like debate. They have a right to have the different opinions, but when it comes to choice of their mother tongue language, there was no debate about their choice of English, because English language was taken as a matter of course as their mother tongue language from the start. There was no question, there was no debate, and there was no discussion about English status as their mother tongue language. That's very curious. However, there is another identity issue. So let's take an example of inner circle countries like Britain or New Zealand or Canada. For example, in Britain, so there is a Welsh language in Wales. So Welsh is a kind of branch of the Celtic language. So the Wales people, they have a desire to maintain their identity as the Wales people. So because of this identity desire, they want to protect their own language, the Welsh language, from the dominant language of English. So in order to protect the Welsh language, the Welsh people, they gave official status to the Welsh language. In another word, so it's mandatory for example, the public address or public signs, it's mandatory to use the Welsh language instead of English language. Why? Because this arises from the identity need. They want to preserve their identity as Welsh people. So they want to protect their own language, Welsh language. So in this case, the people, they give a special status, official status to their own language. So the same is true with the Gaelic language in Ireland. Gaelic language is also a branch of the Celtic language. So in Ireland, people, they want to preserve their Gaelic language. If they didn't attempt to protect the Gaelic language, it could have been dead. But they want to keep the Gaelic language alive. They didn't want their Gaelic language to disappear. So that's why they gave official status to Gaelic language. So this is the way that they chose to protect their own language from the English dominant language. The same is true, the Maori language was given as special status in New Zealand, and also French was given a special official status in inner circle country like Canada. So we are continuing our discussion why English was useful for outer circle countries. For example, the Ghana and Nigeria cases. These are some African countries who become independent after World War. And at the time, as you know, Ghana are multilingual. They have a lot of languages, dialects. So many competition among the different varieties of languages. So the Nigeria is the same. So in this case, they don't want to choose among competing local languages. So they chose English as a neutral language. So this is how the English proof is usefulness. English can serve as a unifying medium of communication within a society. So here comes another question. If these were the 19 and 20 global turning point, then we have another question. How about 21st century? How about 22nd century? How about next centuries? Are there any other global turning point in the post-21st century in the global society that may reverse the current balance of global power? That will be the topic for the next module.